The red sky above the Montana Territory was a warning that Piper Collins failed to heed as she stared out the small window of her isolated cabin, the faint smell of smoke already creeping through the cracks in the weathered logs. It was the summer of 1876, and at 22 years old, Piper had grown accustomed to facing challenges alone since her father's passing the previous winter. But nothing had prepared her for the wall of flames now racing across the drought-stricken grassland toward the only home she'd ever known. Piper's heart pounded against her ribs as she frantically gathered what few valuables she could carry: her mother's silver locket, the small leather pouch containing her life savings, and the deed to the property. The smoke was thickening rapidly, stinging her eyes and burning her lungs. She had waited too long, underestimated the speed of the approaching wildfire. When she finally burst through the front door, the horrifying reality became clear. A ring of fire had already encircled her small homestead. There was no clear path to escape. Piper stumbled back inside, coughing violently, panic rising in her chest. The wooden walls that had sheltered her for so long now felt like a death sentence. 10 miles away, Heath Owens was driving a small herd of cattle back to his ranch when he spotted the ominous column of smoke rising in the distance. At 28, Heath had developed a keen sense for trouble on the frontier. Without hesitation, he turned to his ranch hand. "Take these cattle home, Tom. That fire's headed straight for the Collins place." "You sure about riding toward that inferno, boss?" Tom asked, squinting at the distant smoke. Heath's jaw tightened. "Miss Collins is out there alone. I can't leave her to face that." With a swift kick to his horse's flanks, Heath galloped across the plains, his tan duster billowing behind him. He had spoken to Piper Collins only a handful of times since moving to the territory 3 years ago. Their encounters had been brief: a polite nod at the general store, a tip of his hat at church services. He knew little about her except that she was proudly independent and stubbornly determined to maintain her father's homestead, despite numerous offers to buy her out. As Heath rode closer, the heat intensified and breathing became difficult. His horse grew increasingly skittish beneath him. Through the swirling smoke, he finally caught sight of the Collins cabin, and his blood ran cold. The structure was completely surrounded by flames, with fire already licking at the corners of the roof. "Miss Collins," he shouted, knowing his voice was likely lost in the roar of the fire. Piper, inside the cabin, Piper was losing hope. The temperature had become unbearable, and the smoke so thick she could barely see across the room. She had soaked blankets in water and tried to block the encroaching smoke, but her small water barrel was quickly depleted. She crouched low, clutching her father's old shotgun like a talisman, though she knew it offered no protection against the flames. Through her disorientation, she thought she heard someone calling her name. Hallucinations, she told herself. No one was coming. No one even knew she was in danger. Heath dismounted a safe distance away, tying his reluctant horse to a boulder. The animal whinnied in protest, pulling against the reins. "Stay," Heath commanded firmly, though he knew the horse might break free to save itself and he wouldn't blame it. Pulling his bandana over his nose and mouth, Heath circled the perimeter, looking for any break in the fire line. There was none. The only way to reach the cabin was straight through the flames. It was madness, but he saw no alternative. He removed his duster, soaked it in water from his canteen, and draped it over his head and shoulders. Taking a deep breath, Heath charged through the narrowest section of fire, feeling the intense heat even through his makeshift protection. His boots hit the scorched earth of the yard, and he sprinted toward the cabin, which was now actively burning on one side. "Piper," he shouted again, pounding on the door. "Piper Collins." When no answer came, He threw his shoulder against the door, wincing as the heated wood burned through his shirt. The door gave way on the third attempt, and Heath stumbled into a world of smoke and heat. He dropped to his knees, crawling through the main room. "Piper, where are you?" A weak cough from the corner drew his attention. Through the haze, he made out her slumped form, conscious but clearly struggling to breathe. Heath." Her voice was barely audible, rough from smoke and surprise. "I'm getting you out of here," he said, reaching her side and assessing her condition quickly. Her skin was smudged with soot, her honey-brown hair singed at the edges, but she appeared free of serious burns. Piper tried to stand but swayed dangerously. Without hesitation, Heath swept her into his arms, cradling her against his chest. She felt impossibly light, though whether from her natural build or his surge of adrenaline, he couldn't tell. "My father's shotgun," she whispered, pointing weakly to where it had fallen. "No time," Heath replied, already moving toward the door. "This place is about to collapse." As if confirming his words, a beam from the ceiling crashed down behind them, sending up a shower of sparks. Heath tightened his grip on Piper and pushed through the doorway into the yard. The situation outside had deteriorated further. The fire had completely engulfed the small stable and was closing in on all sides. "Hold on to me," Heath instructed, adjusting his grip to shield her face against his chest. "Keep your eyes closed and don't breathe in if you can help it." Piper nodded weakly, her arms circling his neck with surprising strength. Heath took one final deep breath, said a silent prayer, and charged back through the wall of flame. The pain was immediate and searing. Despite the protection of his damp duster, Heath felt the fire scorching his back and legs. He stumbled once, nearly dropping to his knees, but the precious weight in his arms drove him forward. He focused solely on putting one foot in front of the other, on escaping the inferno with his burden. Then, suddenly, they were through. The air was still smoky but breathable. Heath continued running until they reached his horse, which was pulling frantically at its tether. "We made it," he gasped, finally allowing himself to look down at the woman in his arms. Piper's eyes fluttered open, meeting his gaze with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. Her voice, when she found it, was raw but steady. "You saved my life." Heath carefully set her on her feet but kept a supportive arm around her waist when she swayed. "Can you ride?" he asked, untying his horse. "Yes," she answered, though uncertainty clouded her face. "But all I have, everything is." They both turned to look at the cabin, now fully engulfed in flames. Years of hard work and memories reduced to ash before their eyes. "I know," Heath said softly. "I'm sorry, Piper." He helped her mount his horse, then swung up behind her. As they rode away, Piper leaned back against his chest, exhaustion finally overtaking her. Heath kept one arm securely around her waist, struck by how perfectly she fit against him. "Where are we going?" she murmured, half asleep. "My ranch," Heath answered. "It's safe there." The journey to Heath's ranch took over an hour. Piper drifted in and out of consciousness, lulled by the steady rhythm of the horse beneath her and the solid presence of the man behind her. When she fully awakened, they were approaching a modest but well-maintained ranch house set against a backdrop of rolling hills. "Welcome to Owens Ranch," Heath said, noticing her stirring. "It's not much, but it's home." Piper took in the sturdy barn, the corral with several horses, and the small vegetable garden to one side of the house. It wasn't grand, but it spoke of care and hard work, values she respected deeply. "It's lovely," she said sincerely. Heath dismounted first, then reached up to help Piper down. As his hands circled her waist, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Piper felt a strange flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with smoke inhalation. "Let's get you inside and cleaned up," Heath said, his voice gentler than she'd ever heard it. The interior of the ranch house was simple but comfortable, a main room with a stone fireplace, a wooden table with 4 chairs, and a collection of well-worn but quality furniture. A narrow hallway led to what Piper presumed were bedrooms. "Tom," Heath called out, but received no response. "My ranch hand must still be out with the cattle," he explained. "Make yourself comfortable. I'll heat some water for you to wash up." Piper sank onto a chair, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of her situation. Everything she owned was gone. The cabin her father had built with his own hands was reduced to ashes. She was alone in the world with nothing but the clothes on her back and the few items in her pockets. When Heath returned with a basin of warm water and a clean cloth, he found her staring blankly at the table, a single tear tracking through the soot on her cheek. "Piper," he said softly, setting down the basin. "I know it seems hopeless right now, but you're alive. That's what matters most." She looked up at him, really looked at him perhaps for the first time. His light brown hair was singed at the edges, his tanned face streaked with soot. The shirt on his back was burned through in places, revealing angry red skin beneath. "You're hurt," she gasped, rising to her feet. Heath shrugged, wincing slightly at the movement. "It's nothing serious." "Let me see," Piper insisted, her own troubles momentarily forgotten. When he hesitated, she added, "Please. It's the least I can do after you risked your life for me." Reluctantly, Heath turned, allowing her to examine his back. The burns weren't as severe as they could have been, but several areas were blistering painfully. "Where do you keep your medical supplies?" she asked, her voice taking on a practical tone he hadn't heard before. "Cabinet above the washstand in my bedroom," Heath replied, pointing down the hallway. "First door on the right." While Piper retrieved the supplies, Heath carefully removed what remained of his shirt, gritting his teeth against the pain as fabric stuck to burned skin. When Piper returned, she paused momentarily in the doorway, her eyes widening at the sight of his bare torso. Though injured, Heath Owens was undeniably well built, his muscled shoulders and chest speaking to years of physical labor. Clearing her throat, Piper approached with the medical supplies. "Sit down," she instructed, her voice professional despite the flush she could feel rising to her cheeks. As she gently cleaned and dressed his burns, Heath studied her from the corner of his eye. Despite the ordeal she just endured, there was a quiet strength in her movements, a resilience that he found himself admiring. Her honey-brown hair had come loose from its practical bun, falling in waves around a face that, even smudged with soot, was strikingly beautiful. "Why did you do it?" Piper asked suddenly, breaking the silence between them. "Why risk your life for me? We barely know each other." Heath considered her question seriously. "Would you have ridden past if you'd seen my ranch on fire?" "No," she admitted. "But I'm not sure I would have charged through the flames either." A small smile touched Heath's lips. "I think you would have. You're braver than you give yourself credit for, Piper Collins." Their eyes met again, and this time the connection lingered. Piper was the first to look away, focusing on applying a final bandage to his shoulder. "There," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. "That should help with the healing." "Thank you." Heath stood, reaching for a clean shirt that hung on a nearby hook. "Now it's your turn. You need to get cleaned up and rest. I'll find you something to wear until we can get into town for supplies." The reality of her situation crashed back over Piper. "I can't impose on you like this. Perhaps there's a hotel in town where I could, with what money?" Heath interrupted gently. "Piper, please. Let me help you. You can stay here until you figure out your next steps." Exhaustion and practicality won out over pride. "Thank you," she whispered. Heath showed her to the small guest room, providing her with one of his clean shirts and a pair of trousers that would be comically large but could be belted tight enough to stay up. He left her to wash and change, promising to prepare something to eat. Alone in the room, Piper finally allowed herself to fully process the day's events. She'd lost everything: the cabin, her father's tools, the quilt her mother had made before succumbing to influenza when Piper was just 10. The material possessions could be replaced, but the memories attached to them were irreplaceable. Yet amidst her grief, she found herself thinking of the man in the other room, the quiet cowboy who had risked everything for a neighbor he barely knew. There had been something in his eyes when he carried her through the flames, a fierce protectiveness that had made her feel safer than she had in years. When Piper emerged from the guest room, dressed in Heath's oversized clothing with her hair damp from washing, she found him at the stove, stirring something that smelled surprisingly appetizing. "I hope you like stew," he said, glancing up at her entrance. "It's not fancy, but it's filling." "It smells wonderful," Piper replied truthfully, taking a seat at the table. "I didn't know you could cook." Heath ladled the stew into 2 bowls. "A man living alone learns to feed himself or starve. My mother made sure I knew the basics before I left home." "Where is home?" Piper asked, realizing how little she knew about him despite his being her nearest neighbor for 3 years. "Originally, Colorado. My father had a small ranch there." Heath set the bowls on the table and joined her. "After he died, my mother moved back east to live with her sister, and I decided to try my luck in Montana." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. The stew was indeed good, hearty, and flavorful. Piper hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first spoonful touched her lips. "What about you?" Heath asked eventually. "I know your father passed last winter. Do you have other family?" Piper shook her head. "No one. My mother died when I was young, and my father was an only child. His parents passed before I was born." "That's why you stayed on the homestead alone," Heath said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "It was all I had left of him," Piper confirmed, her voice catching slightly. "And now it's gone too." Heath reached across the table, hesitating briefly before covering her hand with his. "Not everything is gone, Piper. You still have your life, your strength. Your father would be proud of how you've carried on." The simple touch of his hand on hers sent an unexpected warmth through Piper's body. She met his gaze, struck by the genuine concern she saw there. For 3 years, she had viewed Heath Owens as merely the quiet rancher who lived over the ridge, a polite acquaintance and nothing more. Now, she was seeing layers to him she'd never imagined existed. Their quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Heath rose, moving to the window. "It's Tom with the cattle," he said, relief evident in his voice. "And it looks like he brought the sheriff with him." Sheriff Daniel Miller was a stocky man with a graying mustache and eyes that missed nothing. He entered the house with Tom, removing his hat respectfully when he saw Piper. "Miss Collins," he said, nodding gravely. "Tom told me what happened. I'm mighty relieved to see you safe." "Thanks to Mr. Owens," Piper replied, glancing at Heath with undisguised gratitude. The sheriff turned to Heath. "That was a brave thing you did, son. Damn foolish, but brave." Heath shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Anyone would have done the same." "Not anyone," Tom interjected. He was a wiry man in his early 40s with a weathered face and kind eyes. "Most men would have ridden the other direction from a fire that size." Sheriff Miller removed a small notebook from his pocket. "I hate to ask this now, Miss Collins, but do you have any idea how the fire started? It's been dry, but that blaze came up mighty sudden." Piper frowned, thinking back. "I was inside most of the day. When I first noticed the smoke, it seemed to be coming from the north edge of my property, where it borders the old Carson claim." "Carson," the sheriff repeated, writing in his notebook. That land's been bought by the Western Mining Company recently. They've had surveyors out there for weeks. Heath's expression darkened. Surveyors who might not be careful with their campfires. It's possible, Miller conceded. I'll look into it. He tucked his notebook away. In the meantime, Miss Collins, is there anything you need? The town council has a small fund for emergencies like this. Pride warred with practicality in Piper's expression. I have a little money saved, she said slowly, but I'll need to find somewhere to stay until I can. Her voice trailed off, the enormity of rebuilding her life suddenly overwhelming. She's staying here, Heath said firmly, surprising everyone, including himself. At least until she decides what she wants to do next. The sheriff raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Tom busied himself examining his hat brim. Mr. Owens has been very kind, Piper added quickly, her cheeks coloring slightly. But I wouldn't want to impose, it's not an imposition, Heath interrupted. I have the space and you need time to sort things out. It's settled. Sheriff Miller nodded slowly. Well, that solves the immediate concern. I'll ride out to what's left of your property tomorrow, Miss Collins, see if anything might be salvageable, and I'll have a word with those mining company fellows. He placed his hat back on his head. Heath, walk me out. Outside on the porch, the sheriff turned to Heath, his expression serious. You sure about this arrangement? People talk, you know. Heath's jaw tightened. Let them talk. I'm not going to worry about gossip when a woman has lost everything. Miller studied him for a moment. Just be careful. Miss Collins has a reputation to protect, and you're a bachelor living alone. Tom lives here too, Heath pointed out. Tom's not the one who carried her through fire, the sheriff replied with a knowing look. Just think about it. Maybe there's a widow in town who could take her in. Heath watched the sheriff ride away, mulling over his words. The thought of sending Piper to stay with someone else bothered him more than it should. It made perfect sense. A young, unmarried woman shouldn't stay at a bachelor's ranch indefinitely, yet something in him rebelled against the idea. When he returned inside, he found Piper helping Tom clear the table, laughing at something the ranch hand had said. The sight of her moving comfortably around his kitchen, despite the oversized clothes and the trauma of the day, stirred something in Heath's chest. Sheriff gone? Tom asked, noticing Heath in the doorway. Yes, he'll investigate the cause of the fire tomorrow. Heath hesitated. Piper, the sheriff mentioned there might be widows in town willing to take you in if you'd prefer not to stay here. Piper's hand stilled on the dish she was drying. Oh. I suppose that would be more proper. An awkward silence fell over the room. Tom cleared his throat. Well, I'd best check on those new calves before turning in. Miss Collins, it's good to have you here, however long you stay. After Tom departed, Piper and Heath remained in the kitchen, neither quite meeting the other's eyes. I don't want to cause any damage to your reputation, Heath said finally. A young woman staying with an unmarried man, people might talk. Piper set the dish down carefully. People always talk. They talked when I insisted on staying at the homestead alone after Father died. She looked up at him, a glimmer of her usual determination returning to her eyes. But if my presence here makes you uncomfortable, no, Heath said quickly. That's not it at all. I want you to stay. I just wanted to make sure you understood the complications. Their gazes held, and Piper felt that strange flutter in her stomach again. I understand, she said softly, and I'm grateful for your offer. If you're sure, I'd like to stay at least until I can make other arrangements. Heath nodded, a small smile touching his lips. Then it's settled. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed in Heath's guest room, Piper found sleep elusive. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw flames surrounding her, felt the suffocating smoke filling her lungs. But then another image would surface, strong arms lifting her, carrying her to safety, a steady heartbeat against her ear as they rode through the gathering dusk. Heath Owens had been her neighbor for 3 years, yet she realized she'd never truly seen him until today. The quiet, reserved rancher had revealed himself to be brave, kind, and surprisingly gentle. The way he had looked at her when he carried her from the flames as if she were precious cargo had awakened feelings Piper hadn't experienced before. In the room across the hall, Heath lay awake as well, his burns causing discomfort despite Piper's careful treatment. But it wasn't the pain keeping him from sleep. It was the memory of holding Piper in his arms, of her trusting gaze when she realized he had come for her. For 3 years, he had admired her from a distance, her independence, her determination to succeed on her own terms. Today, he had finally spoken more words to her than in all their previous encounters combined. Having her under his roof stirred emotions Heath had long suppressed. After losing his father and watching his mother's subsequent struggle, he had focused solely on building his ranch, convinced that was all he needed. Now, with Piper Collins sleeping just across the hall, he wasn't so certain anymore. Dawn brought a clear sky and the acrid smell of distant smoke still hanging in the air. Piper woke to the sounds of activity in the kitchen and the unfamiliar sensation of being in someone else's home. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then yesterday's events came rushing back: the fire, the rescue, Heath carrying her through the flames. She dressed quickly in the same oversized clothes from the previous evening, doing her best to make herself presentable. When she entered the kitchen, she found Heath at the stove, frying bacon while Tom set the table. "Good morning," Heath said, looking up at her entrance. "How did you sleep?" "Well enough, considering," Piper replied, not wanting to admit to her restless night. "Can I help with breakfast?" "Already taken care of," Tom said cheerfully, pulling out a chair for her. "The boss here was up at the crack of dawn. Says his burns were bothering him, but I think he was just eager to impress you with his cooking skills." Heath shot his ranch hand a warning look, but Piper caught the slight flush on his cheeks. The idea that Heath Owens might want to impress her sent a pleasant warmth through her body. "After breakfast, I thought we might ride into town," Heath said, setting a plate of bacon and eggs before her. "You'll need some proper clothes and other necessities." Piper nodded, suddenly remembering the small leather pouch in her pocket. She pulled it out, counting the contents quickly. "I have $23 saved," she said. "It's not much, but it should cover the basics." Heath and Tom exchanged glances. "Miss Collins," Tom said gently, "a decent dress alone will cost $5 or $6, and you'll need more than one." The reality of her situation hit Piper anew. $23 would not rebuild a life. She had the deed to her property, but the land without a structure was of limited value. The independence she had fought so hard to maintain was slipping away with every passing moment. "I can work," she said firmly. "I'm not afraid of hard labor." "Perhaps one of the shops in town needs help, or we'll figure it out," Heath interrupted, his voice kind but brooking no argument. "One step at a time. First, let's get you what you need for the immediate future." After breakfast, Heath saddled 2 horses while Piper pinned up her hair as best she could without proper pins. She had rolled up the sleeves and pant legs of Heath's clothes, but she still looked like a child playing dress-up in her father's wardrobe. The ride to town took just over an hour. Piper was conscious of curious glances as they rode down the main street of Silver Creek, a modest but growing settlement that served the surrounding ranches and farms. News of the fire had clearly spread, and her appearance in men's clothing astride one of Heath's horses was drawing attention. Their first stop was Mrs. Dawson's mercantile and dressmaking shop. The proprietress, A plump woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner took one look at Piper and ushered her into the back room. "Sheriff Miller rode by early this morning and told me what happened," she explained, already pulling fabric samples from shelves. "You poor dear. Let's get you sorted out." Heath remained in the main shop area, examining tools and supplies with feigned interest, while Mrs. Dawson took Piper's measurements and discussed what items she would need most urgently. "I have 2 ready-made dresses that might fit you with minimal alterations," Mrs. Dawson said, holding up a serviceable blue cotton dress. "And I can have a 3rd made by the end of the week." Piper fingered the fabric, swallowing hard. "Mrs. Dawson, I need to be honest. I have limited funds at present. Perhaps just 1 dress." "Nonsense," came Heath's voice from the doorway. "She'll take all 3, Mrs. Dawson, plus whatever undergarments and nightclothes she needs." Piper spun around, her cheeks flushing with a mixture of embarrassment and indignation. "Mr. Owens, I appreciate your concern, but I cannot allow you to consider it a loan," Heath said firmly. "You can repay me when you're back on your feet." Their eyes locked in a silent battle of wills. Pride urged Piper to refuse, but practicality reminded her that she had few options. Finally, she nodded once, her chin lifted in defiance despite her acquiescence. "A loan," she agreed, "with interest." A small smile played at the corner of Heath's mouth. "If you insist." Mrs. Dawson watched this exchange with barely concealed interest. "Well then," she said briskly, "let's get you outfitted properly, Miss Collins." An hour later, Piper emerged from the back room wearing the blue dress, which Mrs. Dawson had quickly altered to fit her slender frame. Her hair was properly pinned up, and she carried a small package containing a nightgown, undergarments, and a 2nd dress that needed no alterations. The 3rd dress would be ready by week's end. Heath looked up as she approached, and something in his expression made Piper's heart skip. He stared at her as if seeing her for the first time, his eyes traveling from her neatly arranged hair to the dress that properly displayed her feminine figure. "You look." He cleared his throat. "That's a significant improvement over my old clothes." Piper raised an eyebrow, a smile tugging at her lips despite herself. "High praise indeed, Mr. Owens." Heath paid Mrs. Dawson while Piper pretended not to notice the substantial amount exchanging hands. They continued down the street to purchase other necessities: a hairbrush, soap, a shawl for cooler evenings. At each shop, the proprietors expressed sympathy for Piper's loss and often included extra items at no charge: a ribbon for her hair, a small bottle of rose-scented water. Their final stop was the sheriff's office. Daniel Miller was at his desk, examining a map of the surrounding territory. He looked up as they entered, nodding in greeting. "Miss Collins, you're looking more yourself today," he said, standing to offer her a chair. "I was just about to ride out to what's left of your property." "Have you learned anything about how the fire started?" Heath asked, remaining standing by the door. The sheriff's expression darkened. "Not officially, but I have my suspicions. I spoke with some of the mining company's surveyors this morning. They claim they were nowhere near the Collins property yesterday, but one of the Sanderson boys saw them camped less than a mile north of there the night before." "Careless with their fire?" Piper asked. "Or deliberate," Heath muttered. Sheriff Miller gave him a sharp look. "That's a serious accusation, Heath." "Is it?" Heath stepped forward, resting his hands on the back of Piper's chair. "The Western Mining Company has been trying to buy up land all through this valley. They made an offer on my north pasture last month for half what it's worth." Piper turned to look up at him in surprise. "They approached my father last year as well. He refused to sell." The sheriff sighed, removing his spectacles to polish them on his shirt. "I've heard similar stories from other landowners, But starting a fire that's not just unethical, it's criminal. And difficult to prove, Heath pointed out. Indeed. Miller replaced his spectacles. I'll investigate thoroughly, you have my word on that. In the meantime, Miss Collins, is there anything specific you'd like me to look for at your property? Piper thought for a moment. In the root cellar, there's a small metal box. It contains some family keepsakes, letters, my mother's Bible, a few photographs. The cellar might have survived the fire. I'll check, the sheriff promised. If there's anything salvageable, I'll bring it back to town. As they left the sheriff's office, Piper was quieter than before, the reminder of all she had lost weighing heavily on her. Heath noticed her change in mood and gently touched her elbow. Would you like to get something to eat before we head back to the ranch? He asked. The hotel serves a decent meal. Piper hesitated, then nodded. That would be nice. Thank you. The hotel dining room was half full, mostly with local businessmen taking their midday meal. Their entrance caused a brief lull in conversation before the buzz resumed, now interspersed with glances in their direction and whispered comments behind hands. Heath led Piper to a table in the corner, away from the curious eyes. A waitress approached with menus, her gaze lingering on Piper with undisguised curiosity. We heard about the fire, Miss Collins, she said. Such a terrible thing. You're staying at the Owens ranch now. The question seemed innocent enough, but Heath caught the underlying implication. Before Piper could respond, he interjected smoothly, temporarily, while Miss Collins decides on her next steps. My ranch hand Tom lives in the house as well, of course. The waitress nodded, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by this explanation. Of course. What can I bring you today? After they ordered, Piper leaned across the table, her voice low. It's already starting, isn't it? The gossip. Heath sighed. I'm afraid so. Small towns run on gossip like engines run on coal. Perhaps I should look for other arrangements, Piper said reluctantly. I wouldn't want to damage your reputation. My reputation can withstand a few wagging tongues, Heath replied firmly. I'm more concerned about yours. Piper's lips curved in a wry smile. Mr. Owens, my reputation was already the subject of gossip when I insisted on living alone after my father died. Some people thought it was scandalous that I didn't immediately sell the property and move in with a respectable family as a companion or governess. You're remarkably unconcerned with others' opinions, Heath observed, admiration evident in his tone. Not unconcerned, Piper corrected. Just selective about whose opinions matter to me. Her eyes met his across the table. My father taught me that true respect isn't about conforming to others' expectations, but living according to your own principles. Heath nodded slowly. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was, Piper said softly. I miss him every day. Their food arrived, temporarily halting the conversation. As they ate, Heath found himself studying Piper when she wasn't looking. The blue dress highlighted the delicate curve of her neck and the subtle golden undertones in her brown hair. But it was more than her physical appearance that drew his attention. It was the quiet dignity with which she faced adversity, the spark of determination that remained despite everything she had lost. After lunch, they collected their purchases and rode back to the ranch. The day had grown warmer, the summer sun beating down on the dusty trail. They rode side by side, conversation flowing more easily now that they had spent more time in each other's company. Have you always wanted to be a rancher? Piper asked, adjusting her seat in the saddle. Heath considered the question. I suppose I never considered anything else. My father raised cattle and I grew up learning the business. After he died, it seemed natural to continue, though I wanted my own place, not his shadow. That's why you came to Montana, partly, Heath admitted. It was also about proving something to myself, that I could build something from nothing, on my own terms. Piper nodded, understanding perfectly. That's how I felt about the homestead after Father died. Everyone expected me to sell it and move on, but it was mine, something I could nurture and grow. They rode in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. As they crested a hill, Heath reined in his horse, gesturing for Piper to do the same. "Look," he said quietly, pointing to the valley below. From this vantage point, they could see both properties, the charred remains of Piper's homestead to the east, and the thriving Owens ranch to the west. The contrast was stark and painful. "It's strange," Piper said, her voice barely audible above the soft summer breeze. 3 days ago, I knew exactly what my life would be. Now—" She trailed off, her gaze fixed on the blackened earth where her home had stood. Heath studied her profile, noting the way she squared her shoulders even as her eyes reflected her grief. "What will you do?" he asked gently. Piper took a deep breath. "I don't know yet. The land is still mine. I could rebuild if I had the means." She turned to look at him. "But perhaps this is a sign that it's time for a different path." "Whatever you decide," Heath said, "you don't have to face it alone." Something shifted in the air between them, a tangible current that had been building since the moment Heath had carried her from the flames. Piper felt it too, her breath catching slightly as their eyes held. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching riders. Both turned to see Sheriff Miller and another man coming up the trail from the direction of Piper's property. "Miss Collins," the sheriff called as they drew closer. "I'm glad we caught you. This is Mr. Peterson from the bank. He wanted to speak with you about your situation." Albert Peterson was a thin man with a perpetually worried expression. He dismounted awkwardly, adjusting his spectacles as he approached Piper. "Miss Collins, I was distressed to hear about your misfortune," he said, his voice as thin as his frame. "The bank would like to extend our sympathies and discuss your options regarding your property." Piper's expression grew guarded. "My options?" "Yes, well." Peterson glanced at the sheriff, then back to Piper. "Given the circumstances, the bank would be willing to purchase your land at a fair price. It would give you the capital to start fresh elsewhere." "I see." Piper's voice was cool. "And what price does the bank consider fair for land that was valued at $1,200 with improvements before the fire?" Peterson cleared his throat. "Well, without the structures, the value is naturally reduced. We were thinking perhaps $400. 400. Heath interjected, his tone incredulous. "That's robbery, Peterson, and you know it." The banker shifted uncomfortably. "The land has been damaged by fire, and without a habitable dwelling." "The fire didn't damage the soil," Piper interrupted, her voice steady despite the anger flashing in her eyes. "The grass will grow back by next spring. The water rights alone are worth more than $400. Sheriff Miller watched this exchange with interest, his gaze moving between Piper's determined face and Heath's protective stance beside her. "Perhaps you need time to consider," Peterson suggested. "The offer will remain open for 2 weeks. "I don't need 2 weeks," Piper replied firmly. "I'm not selling, at least not to the bank at that price." The banker's lips thinned in displeasure. "Miss Collins, be reasonable. How do you propose to rebuild without substantial capital?" "A woman alone, Miss Collins isn't alone," Heath stated, his voice carrying a hint of warning. "And she doesn't need to make any hasty decisions." Peterson looked between them, a new calculation entering his expression. "I see. Well, as I said, the offer remains open should you reconsider." After the banker and sheriff departed, Piper remained still, staring at the distant horizon. "He's right about one thing," she said finally. "I don't have the means to rebuild." Heath moved his horse closer to hers. "Don't make any decisions yet. Let's get back to the ranch and talk through your options." The rest of the ride was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the ranch, Tom came out to meet them, his expression serious. "Sheriff found something at your place, Miss Collins," he said, holding out a small metal box, scorched but intact. "Said it was in the root cellar, just where you thought it would be." Piper's hands trembled slightly as she took the box. "Thank you, Tom." While Heath took care of the horses, Piper retreated to the privacy of the guest room to examine the box's contents. Inside, she found exactly what she had hoped for: her mother's small Bible with the family history inscribed inside, letters her parents had exchanged during their courtship, and several photographs, including one of her parents on their wedding day and another of herself as a child with her father. These tangible connections to her past brought both comfort and fresh grief. Piper sat on the edge of the bed, carefully turning the pages of the Bible, tracing her finger over her mother's elegant handwriting in the margins. A soft knock at the door interrupted her reverie. "Piper." Heath's voice was hesitant. "May I come in?" "Yes," she called, quickly wiping away the tears that had begun to fall. Heath entered, carrying a tray with tea and what appeared to be freshly baked biscuits. He set it on the small table by the window, then noticed the open box and the items spread across the bed. "The sheriff found it," Piper explained, holding up a photograph. "Family keepsakes. Not worth anything to anyone else, but priceless to me." Heath sat beside her, carefully keeping a proper distance. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the photograph. Piper handed it to him. It showed her at about 10 years old, sitting proudly on a pony while her father stood beside her, one hand on the saddle, the other on her back to steady her. "You look like him," Heath observed. "Something about the eyes and the set of your jaw." A smile touched Piper's lips. "People always said that. It used to frustrate my mother. She'd say I carried her for 9 months and she comes out looking exactly like Robert." Heath chuckled, handing the photograph back. "Thank you for sharing this with me." Their fingers brushed during the exchange, sending that now familiar current between them. Piper looked up, finding Heath's gaze on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I should go help Tom with the evening chores," Heath said, standing abruptly. "Rest a while. We'll talk about your options over dinner." After he left, Piper remained seated on the bed, her fingers lightly touching the spot where his hand had brushed hers. In just 2 days, Heath Owens had become more important to her than she could have imagined. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. That evening after dinner, the three of them sat around the table, discussing Piper's situation. Tom had proven to be both practical and kind, offering suggestions without presuming to make decisions for her. "You've got 3 main options as I see it," Tom said, counting on his fingers. 1. Sell the land and use the money to start fresh elsewhere. 2. Try to rebuild on your property. 3. Find work locally until you decide what you want long term. "The problem with rebuilding is the cost," Heath pointed out. "Even a modest cabin would require lumber, nails, windows, not to mention labor." Piper nodded, having already calculated these costs herself. "And selling to the bank at their insulting offer feels like admitting defeat." "What about option 3? Tom suggested. "Mrs. Dawson mentioned she could use help in her shop, and I heard the school teacher is getting married come fall. They'll need a replacement." "A teacher." Piper considered this. Her own education had been solid thanks to her mother's insistence, and later a year at a ladies' seminary before her mother's illness called her home. "I hadn't thought of that." "You'd be good at it," Heath said, surprising her with his conviction. "You have patience and intelligence, and the children would respect you." Piper felt a flush of pleasure at his assessment. "It would provide an income while I decide about the land," she admitted, "though I'd need somewhere to live in town." No rush on that, Tom said casually, avoiding Heath's gaze. This place is plenty big enough, and it's not like we're using that guest room for anything else. The conversation continued, weighing various possibilities. By the time they retired for the night, Piper had decided to speak with the school board about the teaching position while continuing to consider her options regarding the land. As the days passed, a routine developed. Piper helped with household tasks, insisting it was the least she could do in exchange for room and board. She proved to be an excellent cook, much to Tom's delight, and surprisingly adept at managing the household accounts, which Heath had neglected. "You've saved us nearly $15 this month with better planning," Heath remarked one evening, reviewing the figures she had organized. "I never realized how much we were wasting on poorly planned purchases." Piper smiled, pleased by his approval. "My father always said good management is as important as hard work in running a successful ranch." He was right, Heath agreed, looking up from the ledger to study her face in the warm lamplight. "You have a talent for bringing order to chaos." Their eyes met across the table, and that now familiar connection sparked between them. It had been happening with increasing frequency, these moments of awareness, of unspoken understanding. Neither had acknowledged it directly, but both felt the shifting dynamics of their relationship. A week after the fire, Sheriff Miller rode out to the ranch with news. The mining company's surveyors had been found negligent in managing their campfire, but there was insufficient evidence to prove deliberate arson. They were fined and ordered to compensate Piper for her losses, though the amount $200 was far less than the true value of what she had lost. "It's something, at least," the sheriff said, handing Piper the bank draft. "And the school board is mighty interested in speaking with you about the teaching position. Term starts in September." After the sheriff left, Piper stood on the porch, staring at the bank draft in her hand. $200 was enough to begin rebuilding a small cabin, but not enough to complete it before winter. It was a start, nothing more. Heath joined her on the porch, leaning against the railing beside her. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly. "That I'm at a crossroads," Piper replied honestly. "The teaching position appeals to me. I've always enjoyed working with children, but selling my land feels like giving up a part of myself." Heath was silent for a moment, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. "What if there was a third option?" he said finally. Piper turned to him, curious. "What do you mean?" Heath took a deep breath as if gathering courage. "Our properties border each other. With the right legal arrangement, they could be managed as one larger ranch, more efficient, more profitable for both of us." "A partnership?" Piper asked, trying to understand his suggestion. "Of sorts." Heath turned to face her fully. "Piper, I'm not expressing this well. What I'm trying to say is—" He paused, reaching for her hand. "In the short time you've been here, you've brought something to this ranch and to my life that I didn't realize was missing. Order, yes, but also warmth. Purpose beyond just existing day to day." Piper's heart began to race as she realized where this conversation was heading. "Heath, please, let me finish before I lose my nerve." His hand tightened around hers. "I know this is sudden. We've known each other as neighbors for years, but truly come to know each other only in these past days. Yet sometimes clarity comes in moments of crisis. When I carried you through those flames, something changed for me. I can't explain it properly, but I knew then that you were someone special, someone I couldn't bear to lose." Piper's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying that I care for you, Piper Collins. More than I thought possible in such a short time. And if you could see yourself building a life here not as my guest, but as my wife, I would consider myself the luckiest man in Montana territory." The words hung in the air between them, transforming the very nature of their relationship in an instant. Piper stared at him, processing his declaration, acutely aware of his hand still holding hers and the earnest hope in his eyes. Heath, She paused, struggling to organize her thoughts. This is unexpected. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. I understand if you need time to consider, or if you don't feel. No, Piper interrupted quickly. That's not what I meant. She took a deep breath, finding courage in his vulnerability. The truth is, I've felt it too, this connection between us. At first, I thought it was simply gratitude for your heroism, but it's grown into something more with each passing day. Hope returned to Heath's expression. Then you're not opposed to the idea. Piper smiled, her eyes shining with emotion. I'm not opposed at all, but I am practical. Marriage is a serious commitment, and while I believe what we feel is genuine, perhaps we should allow ourselves a proper courtship before making such a life-altering decision. Heath's answering smile lit his entire face. A courtship? Yes, of course. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Miss Collins, would you do me the honor of allowing me to court you, with the intention of making you my wife if our feelings prove as enduring as I believe they will? The formal request, delivered with such sincere emotion, brought tears to Piper's eyes. Mr. Owens, I would be delighted to accept your courtship. The sound of a throat clearing made them both turn. Tom stood in the doorway, a poorly concealed grin on his weathered face. Sorry to interrupt, but supper's burning and I figured you might want to save it before we're all eating charred potatoes. Heath laughed, the sound full of joy and relief. We'll be right in, Tom. As Tom disappeared back into the house, Heath turned to Piper once more. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, he leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her lips. It was brief but filled with promise, a perfect beginning to their new understanding. I should see to those potatoes, Piper murmured when they parted, her cheeks flushed. Heath nodded, reluctantly releasing her hand. Of course, but Piper, she paused at the door. Yes, I'm glad the fire brought you to me, though I wish it had happened under different circumstances. Piper's expression softened. Sometimes, Mr. Owens, what seems like disaster is merely the universe's way of setting us on the right path. With those words, she entered the house, leaving Heath on the porch contemplating how a tragedy could transform into the greatest blessing of his life. The next 6 weeks passed in a blur of activity and growing affection. True to his word, Heath courted Piper properly, escorting her to church services on Sundays and taking her on picnics by the creek that ran through his property. On Saturday evenings, they often rode into town for dinner at the hotel, or to attend the occasional social gathering. Their courtship became the favorite topic of local gossip, but the initial skepticism gradually transformed into approval as people witnessed the genuine affection between them. Sheriff Miller, in particular, seemed pleased by the development, having seen firsthand the connection that had formed during the fire. Piper met with the school board and was officially offered the teaching position for the fall term. She accepted, feeling a sense of purpose in the role that appealed to her independent nature. The salary was modest, but would be her own contribution to their future together. With the compensation from the mining company and a small loan from the bank, negotiated at much better terms than their initial offer for her land, Piper hired workers to clear the burned debris from her property. Rather than rebuilding the cabin immediately, she and Heath decided to install a sturdy fence connecting their properties and construct a small barn where the cabin had stood. The land would be used for grazing, expanding the ranch's capacity. As summer gave way to early autumn, Heath and Piper sat together on the porch swing he had built for her, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. His arm rested comfortably around her shoulders, her head leaning against him in a posture that had become wonderfully familiar. "School starts on Monday," Piper said, a hint of nervousness in her voice. 18 students ages 6 to 15. I've been working on lessons all week. "You'll be wonderful," Heath assured her, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Those children are lucky to have you as their teacher." Piper smiled, drawing comfort from his confidence in her. "Thank you." She hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking about something else as well." "Oh." Heath turned slightly to see her face better. "Yes." Piper sat up straighter, meeting his gaze directly. "We've been courting for 6 weeks now. In that time, my feelings for you have only grown stronger." Heath's expression softened. "As have mine for you. And while I've enjoyed our courtship immensely," Piper continued, a hint of mischief entering her eyes, "I find myself wondering if we might accelerate our timeline." For a moment, Heath looked confused, then understanding dawned and his eyes widened. "Piper Collins, are you proposing to me?" A laugh bubbled up from her chest. "I suppose I am, in a manner of speaking. Is that terribly forward of me?" Heath grinned, shifting to face her fully. "Terribly, and wonderfully consistent with the independent woman I've fallen in love with." "You haven't answered my question," Piper pointed out, though her eyes shone with happiness at his declaration of love. Heath reached into his pocket, extracting a small velvet pouch. "Perhaps because I had plans of my own for this evening." Piper's breath caught as he opened the pouch, revealing a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. "Heath." "I had planned a more eloquent speech," he admitted, holding the ring between them. "But since you've beaten me to the proposal, I'll simply ask, Piper Collins, will you marry me? Not because of convenience or circumstance, but because I love you with every part of my being and can't imagine spending another day not calling you my wife." Tears of joy sprang to Piper's eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you, Heath Owens." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then captured her lips in a kiss far less restrained than their previous ones. Piper responded with equal fervor, her arms winding around his neck as she pressed closer to him. When they finally parted, both breathless, Heath rested his forehead against hers. "How soon can we make this official?" Piper considered the question seriously. "I start teaching on Monday, perhaps the following Saturday. That would give us time to arrange for Reverend Wilson to perform the ceremony and for me to finish the dress I've been working on." Heath pulled back slightly, surprised. "You've been making a wedding dress?" A blush colored Piper's cheeks. "I may have been anticipating this moment for a few weeks now." His laughter rang out joyful and unrestrained. "I love you, Piper Collins. Never change." The wedding took place on a perfect September day, with the aspen trees just beginning to turn golden against the deep green of the pines. The ceremony was held on the ranch, in the meadow, beside the creek, where they had enjoyed numerous picnics during their courtship. Though small, with only about 20 guests, the celebration was filled with warmth and good wishes. Piper wore the dress she had sewn herself, simple but elegant, with delicate embroidery around the collar and cuffs that she had worked on during the evenings after dinner. Mrs. Dawson had helped with the final fitting and declared it as fine as any dress she'd ever sold in her shop. Sheriff Miller stood as Heath's best man, while Mrs. Dawson served as Piper's matron of honor. Tom had outdone himself decorating the meadow with wildflowers and lanterns that would be lit as evening approached. As Reverend Wilson pronounced them husband and wife, Heath gently lifted Piper's veil and kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of his deep love and commitment. The assembled guests applauded, their genuine happiness for the couple evident in their smiles and cheers. The celebration continued well into the evening, with feasting, dancing, and storytelling around a bonfire. As the night grew late, the guests gradually departed, offering final congratulations and thinly veiled innuendos that made Piper blush and Heath grin. Finally alone, the newlyweds stood in the doorway of what was now their shared bedroom, formerly Heath's alone. He had expanded it during the previous weeks, adding a larger window that overlooked the mountains and building a new bureau for Piper's belongings. "Mrs. Owens," Heath said softly, savoring the new name on his lips. "Welcome home." Piper's eyes shone with happiness as she looked up at her husband. "It's strange," she murmured. "When the fire took my cabin, I thought I'd lost my home forever. I never imagined I'd find a better one so soon." Heath gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. "When I carried you through those flames, I was just trying to save your life. I had no idea you'd end up saving mine." Piper tilted her head, questioning. "Saving yours?" "Yes." Heath's voice grew serious. "I existed before you came here, Piper. I worked, I slept, I did what needed doing. But I wasn't truly living. You brought joy back into my life, gave me a reason to look forward to each new day." Deeply moved by his words, Piper reached up to touch his face. "I love you, Heath Owens. And I love you, Piper Owens." He lifted her into his arms, just as he had done on the day of the fire, but this time without urgency or fear, only love and the promise of a future together. Now and always. As he carried her across the threshold of their bedroom, Piper felt a sense of rightness, of coming full circle. From the terror of the fire to the safety of his arms, their journey had only just begun. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, no longer alone, but partners in all things. 5 years later, Piper stood on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching as Heath taught their 4-year-old son Robert to ride his first pony. Their 2-year-old daughter Elizabeth sat on a blanket nearby, carefully arranging a collection of smooth stones her father had brought her from the creek. The ranch had prospered beyond their expectations. With Piper's organizational skills and Heath's practical knowledge, they had increased their herd significantly. The addition of Piper's land had provided crucial extra grazing space, and the small orchard she had planted where her cabin once stood was beginning to bear fruit. Piper had taught at the school for 3 years before Elizabeth's birth prompted her to step back temporarily. She still tutored several students and planned to return to teaching once Elizabeth was old enough for school herself. "Mama, look." Robert called excitedly as he guided the pony in a small circle, Heath's hand never leaving the lead rope. "I'm riding just like Papa." "I see you, my brave boy," Piper called back, smiling at her son's accomplishment and her husband's patient instruction. As the lesson continued, Sheriff Miller rode up the lane, now sporting more gray in his mustache but otherwise little changed from 5 years earlier. He dismounted with a tip of his hat to Piper. "Afternoon, Mrs. Owens. Fine day for a riding lesson." "Indeed it is, Sheriff." "What brings you out our way?" Miller glanced toward Heath and Robert before turning back to Piper. "Thought you both might want to know the Western Mining Company is pulling out of the territory. Seems their surveys didn't find what they were hoping for." "Well," Piper said with a small smile, "I can't say I'm sorry to hear it. Figured as much." The sheriff reached into his saddlebag. "There's something else. When they cleared out their office in town, they left behind some papers. This was among them." He handed her a folded document. Piper opened it, her eyes widening as she scanned the contents. It was an internal memo, dated a week before the fire that had destroyed her cabin, discussing the strategic importance of acquiring her land and expressing frustration at her refusal to sell. "This suggests they were more involved in the fire than we proved," she said quietly. Miller nodded grimly. "I thought so too. Not that it matters much now, given how things turned out." Piper looked out at her family, her husband now lifting their giggling son from the pony, her daughter content with her stones, the thriving ranch around them. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't change anything." After the sheriff departed, Piper tucked the document away in a drawer. There was no point in dwelling on old suspicions. The fire that had seemed like such a tragedy had led her to the greatest happiness of her life. That evening, after the children were asleep, Piper and Heath sat together on the porch swing he had built during their courtship. It had become their special place for quiet conversations at the end of busy days. "Sheriff brought some interesting news today," Piper said, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "Oh." Heath's arm tightened around her as she related the sheriff's visit and the document he had brought. When she finished, Heath was silent for a moment. "Does it bother you, knowing they might have deliberately set the fire?" Piper considered the question carefully. "It would have once, but now," she shook her head, "if they hadn't, I might never have found my way here, to you. To this life we've built together." Heath pressed a kiss to her temple. "I thank God every day for bringing you to me, even if it came through fire, as do I." Piper turned her face up to his. "I lost a cabin, but I found a home. I'd say that's more than a fair exchange." As their lips met in a tender kiss, the setting sun cast a warm glow over the ranch, not the destructive fire of 5 years past, but a gentle light illuminating the life they had built from its ashes. A home, a family, a love that had been forged in flame and would endure for all their days.